Because oftentimes with anxiety, when we tend to, zone in on our breathing, sometimes that can make it worse. And there are a lot of coping strategies that oftentimes will make things worse. And I often, will say something along the lines of, especially if they struggle with those breathing exercises, they're like, I'm trying to breathe and it's not helping me cope. I'm like, well, yeah, like if you're super angry and someone comes up to you and says, calm down, that's going to make you more angry. Like you're not going to be able, because your mind and your body is not in a state to receive that. And so, really catering some of those coping strategies to what their need is in the moment and helping them identify, okay, maybe breathing strategies isn't the best thing when you're having an active panic attack. Or maybe it is and that works for them and that's great, but being able to decipher that and integrate that. The other one that I often find myself commenting on a lot is writing or journaling. Like people will say, oh, I journal. Like, okay, well, how do you utilize that in the moment when you're having these really intense emotions? How do you utilize that writing? And usually it's like, oh, I'll just write about what's happening, but then I'll hear things like, oh, but it triggers me, looking back at that, or, I don't find it very helpful. So that one I also tend to reframe into being more of an exercise and explaining it as an exercise. Writing doesn't necessarily have to be the traditional, oh, I'm going to journal, dear diary, my day was great, la-di-da-di-da, right? Like it doesn't have to be that. It can be a writing exercise. And so when you're in a state of anxiety, for example, because that seems to be what we're discussing, and you're feeling really anxious, pull out a piece of paper, write down all of those overwhelm, all of those thoughts that are going through your mind. Just start writing them, whether you're writing, really small or really big or cursive or thick letters or thin letters, or you're scribbling all over the paper, or letters are overlapping and words are overlapping and you're kind of just like getting it out of your system. And then I encourage people, get rid of it, right? The release is the writing, the letting go is the letting go, right? And there are a couple ways that I explain that, which if you want more information on that type of stuff, I love talking about coping strategies, so reach out to me. I also tend to pair coping strategies, so step 2 with step 3, and I'll explain that when I introduce coping strategies as well. Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. In this circumstance, I just didn't. So then I would say something like, okay, we're going to move into step 3, which is going to be identifying your distractions. If I was to do those together, I would say something along the lines of, okay, so now that we've identified our warning signs, we're going to move into our coping strategies, which is step 2. But I also like to pair that with step 3, which is your distractions. And the reason I pair those is because a lot of people tend to, there's either a lot of overlap or people tend to confuse coping strategies with distractions. So I want to make that differentiation. So I'll do those two things together. And as my callers are listing out those things, I'll kind of direct them in, okay, well, that sounds more like a distraction. That allows you to take a break. It allows you to take your mind off of it. So therefore, it's going to be a distraction, not a coping strategy. Whereas your coping strategies allow you to work through the emotions. Your distractions allow you to kind of put a pin in it and say, I need a break from this. And so I explain that to the caller as we're going. And I also use this as an opportunity to validate the caller. If the caller's like, yeah, I use the self-care of going to get my nails done. I'm like, that's great. I'm so glad that you take that time, every month to go perform that self-care. Self-care is really important for maintenance coping, for making sure that, you're taking care of yourself and you're feeling that self-love. Or they offer the distraction of, I love to read. And I'm like, yeah, reading can be a really great distraction. It allows you to kind of enter a different world and immerse yourself in something else outside of that emotional dysregulation, which can actually allow your thinking to change and it can allow your feelings to shift. So those are the first 3 steps. And then I say, okay, so we're going to move on to step 4 and step 5. And I also do these together. And I'll explain, step 4 is about your general supports. These are going to be people that you feel comfortable talking to about what you're going through. And those are people that can offer you support and you feel safe speaking to about whatever crisis you're dealing with, whether it's, I'm having a panic attack, I'm just having increased anxiety, or, I'm having these suicidal thoughts. So looking at that whole spectrum. And then the professional supports are going to be people who provide professional care. And I always like to put this in as well, throw in the 24/7 thing, stating, 988 is always going to be a professional support for you. We are always here, and so you can always have that on your safety plan. And then going back to those general supports and asking, I usually state something along the lines, do you feel like you have good friends and family that you would put into that category? If the answer is yes, then I usually have them pause and I say, okay, I want you to, on your end, I want you to take a minute and write down those names specifically. You don't need to share that with me, but on your safety plan, write out who those friends are. Write their names. Write out my brother, my sister, my friend Sally, right? Be specific about it on your safety plan. And that's when I do a little bit of psychoeducation about, what happens when we're in a state of crisis. We go into fight or flight, right? And we're kind of incapable of pulling out some of that information due to the fact that we're in fight or flight. And so it can be hard to pull out a lot of that information. Same thing with coping strategies. And I'll include that that's also part of the purpose of the safety plan, is to be able to just look at it and say, okay, this is what works. Writing is on my safety plan, so I'm going to take out a piece of paper and I'm going to write, okay, that didn't work. So I'm going to go to my support systems. I'm going to call Sally. Sally didn't answer. Okay, what can I do next? And just going through it as a list instead of something else. So I have them identify that. At the end, I always state something along the lines of, a safety plan is meant to be adapted. It's meant to be changed. So as you start to become aware of maybe your warning signs, you start to become more in tune with some of the things that you think about or feel or do as prior to these emotional states starting or the suicidal thoughts coming. Add it to your safety plan. If they state, I don't have any, general support systems, okay, that can be a place that you focus on. Maybe we need to find you a resource where you can get connected with people who provide that support. So I'd say something like, okay, just leave it blank for now, include it in there as your step 4, and then as you get those friends or family members or people or whoever it is, add it in. Same thing with coping strategies. I've had a lot of callers be like, yeah, I've done all that, none of it works. Well, okay, are you using those coping strategies correctly? And that's when you dive into like, okay, what have you tried? You've tried breathing strategies. Okay, well, breathing strategies notoriously don't work when you're having a panic attack. So maybe we try a grounding strategy instead. So there's a lot of psychoeducation that happens during safety planning. It takes up the majority of the time. And most of the time when I do safety plan with a caller who's never safety planned before, I expect that call to be 45 minutes, 50 minutes, or going into the hour mark, just because it's so much information. And I want to make sure that safety plan is, 1, intentional, 2, they understand how to use it, when to use it, why they're using it, and 3, that it's super individualized, that those coping strategies are coping strategies that, 1, they feel like they're able to do, 2, if it's something new, they feel like they even want to try it. I feel like a lot of times counselors will just be like, oh, you should do journaling as a coping strategy. And the person's like, I don't want to journal. I don't want to do that as a coping strategy. So if it's not going to be effective, why are we putting it on there, right? We want to create a plan that's actually going to be individualized and personalized to this person, and making sure that we're actually diving into some of those things and teaching them how to use it. This isn't taught. This isn't well-known information that, like, when you're mad or you're angry, instead of punching a wall, maybe we could punch a pillow, or maybe we could go do some other form of exercise to get that energy out. There are so many things that can be used as a coping strategy, and I often see that it's like those top 5 things that were taught in school, and people are just like, this is useless. I don't want to use this. The other thing that I really make sure that I do during safety planning is as I'm going through it, I make sure to stop and say, does that make sense? Do you have any questions? Is that something you feel like you want to do or want to try? And sometimes they'll say no, and you're like, okay, well, what's something else that we can explore? Maybe, we go super basic and start with like, well, what are activities that you enjoy doing? Okay, you enjoy drawing. Can we start to utilize that as a coping strategy? And how can we adapt that activity to become a coping strategy to help us process through the emotions that we're feeling, right? Because that's the purpose of a coping strategy. A coping strategy is not a magic pill. It's something that you have to be able to do, something you're interested in doing that's going to help you process through what you're experiencing in a way that's going to make you feel better. It's going to provide that comfort, provide that support. And then there's self-care also included in coping strategies. And that can be as simple as taking a warm shower and just making your body physically feel better. Brushing your hair, brushing your teeth. A lot of people who struggle with depression struggle to brush their teeth, things of that sort. And then the last part of safety planning is always, the safer environment. If a caller has not endorsed self-harm, I usually don't. I speak about the safer environment aspect as step 6, say you can add it in there, but then I'm like, this isn't really applicable to you. If there's something that I feel like, maybe when they're anxious, they turn to smoking weed or they have an unhealthy coping strategy, sometimes I'll use that 6th category to kind of reframe, like, well, how can we maybe remove the behavior that, or the items that you use within that behavior to create a safer environment so you can use healthier coping strategies, if that makes sense. The other thing that I totally forgot to mention is with coping strategies, sometimes that's when I'll ask, like, do you have a history of substance use? Is that something that you've used to cope in the past? And I'll kind of weave it into that conversation instead of assessing for that up with the safety assessment, just because it tends to flow a little bit better within that. And sometimes that's also when I'll assess for self-harm by asking the question of, have you ever turned to self-harm, cutting, pulling hair, banging your head to help cope through those things? And if they say yes to that, if they're using self-harm or substances to cope, that's when I turn to like, okay, how can we replace that behavior with something else that's going to give you the same sensation, the same physical response, but maybe that it's a little bit healthier, or at least something that can like start that process. So I know that was a lot and I just talked a lot. If you have any questions, reach out to me. I'd be happy to answer them. I'm also going to type up the script and just see kind of how that plays out. And that'll be super generic, but it'll include a lot of that information. So maybe you could start using that as a guide if you needed it.